coffee culture. And that is because I've just spent 3 months in Portugal, in the Algarve, working in a hotel in the middle of the countryside. And I did actually wonder whether I should do my speech about politics and about the recent elections in Portugal. But I thought, no, I'll do it about something more interesting, which is, after all, the fuel of interpreters, and that is coffee. Bearing in mind that where I was working, some of my colleagues would have 5 to 10 small coffees a day, I thought it was probably worth addressing the fact. So I'm going to talk to you about Portuguese coffee culture. And you might think, why am I talking about coffee in Portugal? Surely Italy is the champion of coffee. But to be quite honest, working in the hotel restaurant, I have never heard so many different ways to order a coffee. And I've also never seen so many full cafes as well. Even in the nearest town to me, which had a population of 400 residents, there were at least 4,000 residents. There were at least 20 cafes. So that means there was about one cafe per 200 people. You wonder how they stay open. Anyway, back to what I was saying about the many different ways to order coffee in Portugal. It all depends on the region, which adds another level of complexity. If you want a simple espresso, if you're in Lisbon, you'll order a bica. If you're in Porto, you'll order a cimbalinho. Or if you're anywhere else, you can just ask for a café, which obviously means coffee, and you'll get an espresso. Even this was enough to confuse the Brits that I saw that stayed in the hotel. Many of them ordered a coffee and were expecting a huge cup of basically milk like you get in Starbucks, and they were very perplexed to see this tiny little cup of espresso come out. So other types of coffee you can get in Portugal. There's the espresso, as I said, and then if you want something even smaller and more intense than an espresso, you can order an Italiana, which is an extremely concentrated small coffee. Otherwise, you can order a cheio, which means a full coffee, and that's like a slightly larger, weaker espresso. If you want an espresso with a drop of milk, then you can order a pingado. And there were other quite disgusting sounding varieties, if I'm honest, such as the mazagran, which is made of lemon, ice and coffee. Not a combination I ever would have thought of putting together. The strangest coffee-related request I heard during my time in this hotel was for espresso in a boiling hot cup, which is apparently a perfectly acceptable request in Portugal, even in the 30-degree heat. And what this involved was taking a small espresso cup and running boiling hot water over it until it was too hot to even touch, and then filling it with espresso. Coffee is particularly cheap in Portugal, which was great news for me because, as I said, it's the fuel of interpreters and it's also the fuel of hotel workers. And I was overjoyed to find that you can get an espresso for around 70 cents in most places. The cheapest I saw it at was 45 cents for an espresso. So as you can imagine, I was appalled to come back to Paris and find myself paying around $3.50 for a milky coffee or $2.50 for an espresso. As I said before, it did cross my mind how all these cafes managed to stay open with such low prices, but apparently it only costs around 10 cents to produce an espresso. So I suppose that gives them a 35-cent profit margin, and considering the amount of people that go in there every day, you can understand actually how they stay afloat. These cafes also sell Portuguese pastries and other goodies, such as the famous pastel de nata, which some of you might have heard of. A lot of them also have a basic lunch menu involving toasted sandwiches, steak sandwiches, and a few of them even had a sign in the window saying "Há caracóis," which means there are snails. I wasn't sure if this was supposed to entice customers in or warn them about a snail infestation. I never found out anyway because I didn't try them. So, as I said, coffee is traditionally associated with Italy, but Portugal is actually in part responsible for its success around the world. It was thanks to a Portuguese-Brazilian soldier called Francisco de Melo Palheta that coffee was introduced to Brazil and then consequently to Portugal. This Francisco de Melo Palheta was sent on a mission to French Guinea, and while he was there he collected some coffee seeds and plants and brought them back to Brazil in the year 1727. And then the Portuguese colonists in Brazil set up the first coffee plantations, and throughout the 18th century coffee was exported to Portugal for roasting in the country, and it was enjoyed by the elite, the royals and the nobles. However, after the 1755 earthquake, which completely destroyed Lisbon, the Marques de Pombal decided that the common people should have the right to drink coffee too, and he encouraged the establishment of public cafes in Lisbon. These cafes became centres for debate amongst the educated, and they were havens for meetings between artists, writers and politicians. Throughout the next century, the 19th century, coffee was one of Brazil's main exports. And in fact, many of Portugal's colonies turned out to be very good coffee growers, and this was quite fortunate really, because under the Salazar dictatorship, which lasted until 1974, they could only import coffee from these colonies into Portugal because they had zero ties with other countries. Nowadays, Portugal is the world's 19th biggest importer of coffee, and it mainly imports from Vietnam, followed by Uganda, and then Brazil. The Portuguese market nowadays is mainly dominated by the brands Cical and Bondi, which are owned by Delta and Nestle. And the way of roasting beans is slightly different from the Italian method. In the Portuguese method, beans are slow roasted at a low temperature. Most coffee making machinery in Portugal is Italian, but it's been adapted to the Portuguese temperature and water pressure, because in Portugal they have higher water pressure than in Italy, so it makes a slightly different coffee with a slightly different taste. So now you know a bit more about why coffee is so popular, good and cheap in Portugal. And for my part, although everyone can still tell I'm British from my accent in Portuguese, at least I can order a coffee like a local.